Hey everyone, as I mentioned previously, I am doing a Q&A episode today, so it'll just be me. Hopefully you don't mind that. But before we jump in, I just wanted to shout out all of my Patreon supporters. We have Katie Schaefer, Tim Matthews, Kevin Corpy, Whitney Beeler, Andy Howard, Mike Stephen King, Bryant Burnett, Janice Hawkins, Mark Davitt, Matt Morris, Bill Kimler, Emily Ascani, and Nicholas McGraw. Thank you all so much for supporting the podcast. I know this has been a wild journey here, so I am so thankful to have you all along for it. And now we'll go ahead and dive into some questions. I am going to cover the questions from my Patreon supporters first, and we have a question from Mark Davitt. What were your most and least favorite screen adaptations? I can tell you my least favorite right off the bat. It was A Return to Salem's Lot. I remember watching it. I don't remember much about it at this point now, but if I'm not mistaken, I gave it half a star on Letterboxd out of 5, and I just don't know why it existed. It's one of those derivative works that isn't a direct adaptation of anything. So for me, I was just like, okay, cool, you went back to Salem's Lot, and that's kind of it. That's all I remember. But as far as my favorite, it's hard to pick just one, but I think I'm going to go with the 2017 It adaptation, just because I love how well Andy Muschietti captured the coming of age part of the story with the Losers Club, and it's one that I can easily rewatch over and over again and not get tired of it. And I'm not someone who rewatches stuff a lot, so for me, that's sort of a big deal. And there are a bunch of others up there, like The Shining. I love the Misery adaptation, but if I was forced to pick just one, I'd probably go with It. So Mark, thank you for that question. I think that's a nice one to start off with for this Q&A. Next up, Bill Kimler asks, do you ever find yourself in any type of competitive mode with some of the larger podcasts out there like the Losers Club or the KingCast? Do you worry at all about feeling like you're duplicating some of their work, or do you not even listen to them and carve out your own path? Bill, fantastic questions. I thought about this a lot when I was starting the podcast because Chat Sematary started in between the Losers Club and the KingCast. If I'm not mistaken, the KingCast started sometime towards the beginning of the pandemic, and I think the Losers Club started a year and a half before I started Chat Sematary. And I actually went into like Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app at the time and looked up Stephen King podcasts. So I saw that the Losers Club existed, as well as Dairy Public Radio and some others. And I kind of looked at what they were doing. And one of the first things I noticed about the Losers Club was that they had a 4-hour episode on It, and I knew right away that I wouldn't be doing it quite the same way as they do, and I love what they do. I was actually a guest on one of the Losers Club episodes, so as far as it being competitive, I don't really think of it that way, because I think all of the Stephen King podcasts that I'm aware of are kind of tackling things in a different way, like Underrated Stephen King, and you have the Dark Tower podcasts that are out there. You have so many Stephen King podcasts that are sort of taking different approaches. And even though the Losers Club and Chat Sematary are similar in going through their works chronologically, the Losers Club has a panel of co-hosts and obviously guests too. And I went the direction of booking guests every week, which, hindsight, didn't make it easy on myself, that's for sure. But I enjoyed the process. And so I'm honestly just inspired by the other podcasts. And, the KingCast is over there getting Jamie Lee Curtis on and all of these famous people in the horror community that I think a lot of us love so much. And that's really cool to see. So because the KingCast came after Chat Sematary, I have listened to some more episodes, and I've listened to more episodes of the Losers Club since catching up, but I did kind of have a rule that I wasn't going to listen to anyone else's episodes if I had not already done that episode for Chat Sematary, just because I didn't want to inadvertently say the same thing as someone on another podcast and just not realize it, because that's absolutely something I would do. So I never saw it as a competitive thing, despite the fact that I am a very competitive person. But that's more so when it comes to like games and sports. Instead, I think of it as a community. Everyone I've talked to who has other horror podcasts, but specifically other Stephen King podcasts, they've all been fantastic to talk to. I loved being a guest on the Losers Club. I loved getting to know some of their Patreon supporters, who then became some of my Patreon supporters. So, it's a mutual thing, and I really love that community behind it. So yes, I did try to sort of carve out my own path, and I think most people would agree that the way I chose to do it was a little maniacal, probably, to put it nicely, if that's putting it nicely anyway. So for me, I just wanted to get through everything chronologically. I've only done the fiction, so I do still have some nonfiction stuff I want to dive into, and then from there, I'll sort of be figuring things out to try and take a new approach. I'm considering things like doing episodes on specific characters, especially characters that appear in multiple works of King's. I think that could be fun. And obviously he has more books planned already. There are more adaptations. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to seeing what I can come up with next that the listeners will hopefully continue to enjoy. So Bill, again, fantastic questions. Thank you for those. Next up, Bryant Burnett, who has been a guest on the podcast and is also a Patreon supporter. If you had to break it down to a single thing, what do you think it is about King's work that made you realize that you wanted to tackle a project as large as this? Honestly, I don't think I thought it through all that much, but when I was a kid growing up, my mom had all of the mass market paperbacks, not all of them. I think she stopped buying them with Wizard and Glass. So a good portion of them, and they were sitting on a bookshelf outside my bedroom. So I would walk by them constantly, and someone had bought me a copy of Cell, and we had a hardcover copy of The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon that someone else had gifted to my parents. And I kind of started out by reading Cell, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, and then my mom had the chap books for The Green Mile. So I read those because I was like, oh, look at these small, cute books. I shouldn't have read The Green Mile when I did, but it's okay because apparently I had forgotten a lot of it by the time I got around to doing this podcast. So it wasn't necessarily a single thing, but I had watched some of the movies. I had seen part of the It miniseries from the 90s, and there was something about the world that Stephen King built that just inherently pulled me in. It was like the small town creepy vibes, which are very much my jam. Like, looking back on it now, those are some of the things that I love to consume. It's like haunted house stories, which is probably why I like Mike Flanagan's shows on Netflix so much, and things that happen in small towns that, even though all of these terrible things happen in them, I still really, really want to visit them. I don't know why, but Derry is obviously a place that instantly feels like that, especially when you dive in to it and some of the other stories that kind of touch on Derry. Same with Castle Rock, even in The Shining. It's not necessarily taking place in a town, but the hotel is so big and it's so isolated that it was just that element of King's stories that really hooked me. And I was like, all right, I'm going to read more of these. I can't say that Cell is what hooked me because I didn't remember enough of it for that to be the case, but just his character work too. The way he writes all of his main characters. That is what made me want to keep going. Even when I came across ones that I didn't like. I cannot even name the main characters in the Tommyknockers, if I'm being honest. And it could simply be because I went through all of this stuff way too fast. But I think there's something about a lot of the characters that make them memorable for the most part, unless it's stuff I didn't enjoy, which those were few and far between, luckily. So, Bryant, I hope that answered your question. Thank you for that. And now I have a few from Twitter as well. Dennis Freeman, what is your absolute favorite short story by Stephen King? We'll count novellas, even though I don't really want to as well. Well, Dennis, I'll give you a 2-for-1 here, because as far as novellas go, I'm probably going to say The Body is my favorite one. If I had to pick one, I know I've done like top 5 lists here and there, and I've never really put them in order. I just kind of think about, okay, here's 5 I really, really enjoy. So we'll go with The Body for novellas. I love the coming of age stories. And then as far as short stories go, the short stories are a little harder because I blew through the collection so fast that it was more difficult for them to stick with me. But if I'm not mistaken, 1408 is considered a short story, and that one I absolutely love. So I'm going to go with that for favorite short story. I do plan to revisit a lot of the collections, maybe not necessarily the novella collections, just because those ones did stick with me a little more, but that's something on my list to do, is sort of absorb the short stories in a better way going forward. And maybe I'll do episodes on specific stories and hopefully remember them better than I did the first time around. But Dennis, thank you for that question. Next up, Words and Whiskey. Go check them out at Words and Whiskey Pod on Twitter. And by the way, Dennis was at the Terrorverse. So from Words and Whiskey, what's one thing you'd like to see done or redone as far as adaptation goes? So much has been done already, but aside from what's already been announced, I don't want to just give an easy answer and be like, oh, I'm excited for Salem's Lot and Firestarter. But I think I'm really looking forward to how the Institute gets handled, because I know it was optioned, but we don't really have a ton of details on that one. And I actually have read that book twice because I was sent an advance copy. So I read it when they sent it to me, and then I read it again when the episode was coming up for the podcast because I wanted to remember it a little better. But we have 4 Carrie movies. I don't think we need any more. We have 2 Shining adaptations. I don't think we need any more. I'm guessing we won't get something like a It limited series, even though I would love to see a 8 to 10 episode version of that, just because of, 1, how recent the last 2 films were, and 2, that one's just tough to adapt. I think it's going to be quite some time before anyone circles back to it, but that is honestly one thing I would really love. But the Institute, if we're going for things that haven't been done yet, and a It limited series, if we're going for something that I would love to eventually see redone. I don't want it right now. I want to just enjoy It 2017 for what it is. And I think, like I said, it'll take some time for people to circle back to that one. But Words and Whiskey, thank you. And again, everyone, go check out that podcast as well. And the last question from Tom Juice at TomBJuice1 on Twitter. After absorbing so much Stephen King in a short time and essentially data dumping from story to story, that's a very good description of what I did, which stories or ideas remain most vivid in your memory? It is tough to differentiate between source material and adaptation at this point, but some of the stuff that really stuck with me as far as the stories themselves go is just how King built up the Dark Tower universe. I wasn't sure at first if I was going to like it because fantasy isn't a thing I've been into for a long time. I've enjoyed stuff like Harry Potter over the years when I was a kid growing up, and then I kind of moved away from that, and, murder mystery stuff is more my speed. So on that note, though, the Bill Hodges trilogy was something that I really, really ended up enjoying because it sort of gives you the murder mystery, supernatural. It gives you so many things in those 3 books that it really meshed well with my tastes. And I know those books aren't going to be for everyone as far as Stephen King works go, and I think that's okay. But The Dark Tower really, really surprised me, and just the whole idea of Midworld and the beams. It is so, so fascinating what Stephen King is able to come up with in that brilliant mind of his. And I'm going to be honest here, I probably didn't understand every single thing that happened in the Dark Tower because, Tom, like you said, it was a big data dump in my brain for all of this. And I never really had a chance to sit with anything until now. And I technically caught up back in September of 2021 because that was when I finished watching Chapelwaite and The Stand and finished whatever books I had left, Billy Summers and later. And now that I've had time to kind of sit with what I've done, I think those are the things that really have stuck with me. And there's a lot to also be said about how King writes female characters in particular, which maybe that's an entire episode for another day, but King's writing isn't necessarily perfect all the time. And I think the fact that he's still willing to grow and learn from past mistakes and do what he can to bring things into the present day, that's something I have greatly appreciated throughout this process as well. So that's another one. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but hopefully I did. And, those were all of the questions I got. So I'm just going to take a few minutes here and sort of talk a little more about the experience overall, because this was not the best way to do this podcast, but it was the way I needed to do it in order to get it done. This was a very goal-oriented podcast for me. I started this for selfish reasons. I wanted to read everything Stephen King, and I knew if I didn't have a deadline, it just was going to either take absolutely forever or I just wouldn't finish it at all. So I had already started my other podcast, Welcome to Geekdom, and had hosted 2 others before even doing that. And for me, I was like, okay, how can I make this a fun process? And way more work, apparently, because podcasts are a lot of work. So it was one of those things where it was like, okay, I have this idea. It's probably not the best idea I've ever had, but I'm going to do it anyway, which I think is how most of my ideas come about. Since so many of the books were already there, I didn't have to go out and find a bunch because I had actually already been filling in the blanks from where my mom's collection left off. And you can tell because, like, if you look at the Stephen King shelf, it's like all these nice same-sized mass market paperbacks, and then it's just like a wild collection of giant hardcovers, taller paperbacks, mass market paperbacks, and it's actually a little jarring to look at sometimes, but it was overall a very fun process. It was stressful at times doing this weekly and sticking to my guns on not taking too many breaks. I took holidays off, I want to say, once in a while. Maybe I took a Thanksgiving week off and then Christmas week, and that was sort of it. So I was chugging away doing at least 50 episodes a year, and it took a little over 3 years here. I started this in October of 2018. I dropped the trailer on Halloween. So really the episode started in November of 2018, and it is now February of 2022, and I am all caught up until, well, frankly, until Stephen King puts out another book in 2 weeks. And then, quick note on that too, by the way, I will be going on a vacation from the end of February through early March, so that episode probably won't be out until roughly mid-March. It'll also give all of the listeners time to read it as well, which I think will be good because then you can consume the episode shortly after you've read it. Hopefully I won't keep you guys waiting too long on that one, but thank you all so much for joining me on this journey, and thank you to those of you who asked questions. Hopefully I didn't get too long-winded here. I really, really loved all of the questions, and I'll probably sprinkle in some more Q&As here and there just because now that I don't have a strict schedule for the podcast, I can kind of fill in weeks with things like this that allow the listeners to interact with me more and vice versa. And again, thank you all so much. This has been an absolute blast. I am also very tired, but I'll be back soon with more new episodes as I sort things out on my end and figure out what exactly I am going to do. But I can tell you right now, definitely going to cover Dance Macabre, On Writing, Secret Windows, Stephen King's weird gargoyle coffee table book that I didn't know existed until recently, and I'll have some other stuff in the works, so stay tuned for all of that.